Is this on? Yes, I think it is. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm delighted to welcome you, and as well, of course, Colm Tóibín and Claire Armitstead to this evening's event at the Charleston Festival. They both attended the festival on several occasions in the past, and I'm always delighted when they accept my invitation, both of them, to come back again. Colm Tóibín is the author of 8 novels, 3 of which has been shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize: The Blackwater Lightship, The Master, and The Testament of Mary. And in fact, The Testament of Mary was dramatised, and it featured Fiona Shaw, who's going to be appearing at the festival reading T.S. Eliot, not Colm, on Bank Holiday Monday. One of Tom's most recent novels, Brooklyn, is currently being made into a film. In fact, I think the film is completed. And will it be shown this year? Yeah, it will be shown this year. That's Brooklyn. I'm sure most of us, or many of us, will have read that wonderful book. And Colm is also a very accomplished writer of short stories. His current novel, Nora Webster, is set in his hometown in Ireland and recreates many of his memories from his early years. Anyone who reads Tom's books will be aware of his if they read his prose, they'll be aware of his very poetic sensibility. And it's not surprising that he cites Tom Gunn and Elizabeth Bishop, as the American poets, as amongst his most enduring literary influences. And his illuminating and sensitive study of Elizabeth Bishop has just been published. Claire Armitstead is the head of books for The Guardian and The Observer, and I like to think of her, and I do think of her, as the soul of The Guardian and The Observer over many years. So before I hand over to Claire and to Colm, I would also like to thank Rathbinny Wine Estate for supporting this event and for helping to make the whole festival possible. So I'm going to hand over to Claire, who will steer us through the rest of this session.
Hello, everyone. It's always a pleasure when somebody else does the housekeeping, the busy bits. I don't have to remember how many novels you've written, because there are rather a lot of them. We're here to talk. The subject title of this talk is The Literature of Loss. And it's really interesting how these 2 books, the novel which most of you... How many of you have actually read Nora Webster? Lots and lots and lots of you know Nora Webster. How many of you have read On Elizabeth Bishop, the monograph? One person right at the back. But what is really interesting about them is how they talk to each other. And I feel that I spent sort of 3 or 4 hours with this Elizabeth Bishop book learning things about the way that Colm writes, and also what had gone into Nora Webster that I didn't know, because actually anybody who knows Colm's work really well will know that he doesn't write from a dispassionate position. Everything is always very passionately invested in yourself. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But would you like to start by reading a bit that isn't actually about loss? So we're going to make it quite clear that this isn't just going to be a gloomy session.
This book, Nora Webster, is set, as you people who read it know, between about 1967 and 1972. And I was trying to think, I mean, there were obvious things that happened, especially in Ireland. You can think about the beginning of the Troubles. And I put those into the book. I mean, the moments when Donald, the younger son, to see something on television and says, "Come down and look, there's something on television." And they realise it's Northern Ireland, that it's Belfast, it's both far away and very close. But they're public things. And also the moon landing is a public thing. And the increase in public spending in Ireland on such things as social welfare was public. But I wanted something that was public but seeped into the private in a way that mattered. And of course, one day I realised, oh my God, this novel is set in the 60s. And it's the least 60s novel you could ever read. You say, well, if you really want to know what happened in the 60s, don't read this book. I mean, it there's no mention. I mean, there may be a vague mention, because one of the daughters goes to London and comes back with loads of clothes that she's bought in Carnaby Street. But other than that, everyone is still Catholic, everyone is still vaguely nationalist, everyone votes the same way in elections, everyone drinks tea, everyone sort of talks about everything except what matters to them. And things are very, very stable. This Republic of Ireland place is a very stable place. And I have no memory. There was one guy who had long hair, but that was the 70s. And he was the only guy in my school with long hair, and it was talked about all the time. There were really deep divisions on the matter, and it was the only son. Connor Lynch's hair was widely, and teachers said, he's not coming into my class next week and let you cut your hair. But in the 60s, nothing. No real sign of miniskirts. There was a thing called the maxi skirt, but no miniskirts and no long hair, and really not, certainly the Beatles, we saw them on television, but that was distant. They didn't play in the town or anything. Or the Rolling Stones didn't play in the town. So the one thing I did think of that happened in the 60s, I think that really changed the town, changed the colour of the town, certainly, was the appearance of cheap hair dye for women. And I mean, this is really not nothing because, of course, Nora's a widow. And the idea of a widow in 1967, I mean, she's in her late 40s, in a small town in Ireland, actually dyeing her hair is quite a serious thing. But it really did happen, not just in our house, but in everyone's house, where overnight, it would be almost like seeing fall colours. You know, the night before, there had been an entire forest of green trees. And then when you get up in the morning, they were all russet and orange and yellow. And I mean, it was really quite a revolution. There's a mention here of dinner. And this is a time when dinner is at 1 o'clock. And you have tea at 6 o'clock. But you would never have your dinner at night. And the other thing is, there's a mention of Tom and Margaret, who are Nora's very conservative brother-in-law and sister-in-law. And then at the very end...
Jim and Margaret.
Sorry, Jim and Margaret.
And we've got a bit of an obsession with Tom tonight, haven't
yes,
I? I wonder why that
is. You know, he's called, that particular uncle is called Tom in another novel. He's called Tom... he's called Tom in The Heather Blazing. So, unfortunately, I have used Margaret and Tom as the aunt and uncle before, but for some reason I made him Jim this time round. And, oh my God, we're all Tom. And the two children at the very end, the two boys who are 12 and 8, are called Connor and Donal. On Wednesday morning, she went downtown and had her hair done, talking to Bernie in the hairdresser about a new system of dyeing hair she had read about, wondering if it was time that she did something about the grey. I wouldn't like it blue, she said. I know what you mean, Bernie replied. And if it was too black, then it would look dyed, and I was never blonde. Everyone in the town knows I was never blonde. Is it a good brown, so that it might not look dyed? I could try this one. Bernie showed her a package with a photograph of a woman with curly brown hair that looked natural. Maybe just start off with a small bit, she said. The instructions, Bernie said, say to use the whole thing. I've used it before. It's very popular. You would be surprised who has it. Oh. Well, try it so, Nora said. Once the dye had been applied, Bernie put a nylon net on her head and left her to flick through some magazines. When she saw that she would not be home in time to cook a proper dinner for the boys, she regretted having come here at all and knew that she would have to go soon. She signalled to Bernie, who was now busy with two women who had come in together and appeared to need to consult each other about each clip of the scissors. I'll be right with you, Bernie said. When she came over to remove the net, Bernie told her not to worry or look too closely, as the real change would come only once the dryer and a brush and comb were used. Nora was aware that the two women Bernie had been looking after were studying her closely. Nora wondered if she should not have consulted other women before getting her hair dyed for the first time. But she couldn't think of anyone she could have asked. Both of her sisters, she presumed, dyed their hair, but she never heard them talking about it. Slowly, as she watched Bernie working with the hairdryer, she realised that she was been given the hairstyle of a much younger woman, and that the women watching it all happen knew that and were taking it in with considerable satisfaction. The more Bernie worked, the more her hair seemed to look like a wig. She knew that the dye would take time to wash out, but in the mirror she could see how pleased Bernie was with her own work. There would be no point in complaining. Is it not a bit young for me? She asked. I think you look great, Bernie said. This cut is very fashionable at the moment. I've never had a fashionable cut before, she said. When it was finished, she knew that anyone who saw her on the way home would think she had lost her mind, or that she was trying to look like a young woman rather than someone who was recently widowed. It'll take a few days to get used to, Bernie said, but no one has grey hair anymore. Does the dye not look very unnatural? In a few days, it will lose that look, and people will think you've had it all your life. You look very worried, but I promise you that by the weekend, you'll be delighted with it. You can't wash it out, can you? No, but it will fade, and I guarantee that you'll be back in a month for the same again. I've never known anyone to go back to the grey, but maybe the next time we'll think of putting some highlights in. They're all the rage now as well. Highlights? Oh, I don't think so. Outside, she lifted her head high and hoped that all the women in Court Street and John Street would be busy cooking and that none of them would be standing at the door. She prayed that she would meet no one she knew. In her mind, she went through the worst possible encounters, the people who would most deplore the idea that with her husband 6 months in the grave, she had dyed her hair a colour it had never been before. She thought of Jim and knew that she would have to face him and Margaret within a week. They would not know what to think. As she saw Mrs. Hogan from John Street walking towards her, Nora could not tell whether Mrs. Hogan simply did not recognise her or if she wanted to get by her without making any comment. Just as Mrs. Hogan approached her, she seemed almost to jump. Her face quivered and then she stopped. Well, that will take some getting used to, she said. Nora tried to smile. Was it Bernie? Mrs. Hogan asked. Nora nodded. I heard she got some new packets in all right. God, I must go to her myself. If Mrs. Hogan, in her apron and a pair of very worn-looking shoes, felt that she had the right to comment on Nora's hair, then there was, Nora felt, no reason why she could not comment in reply. Well, you know where she is, she said dryly, looking at Mrs. Hogan's hair, clearly suggesting that it could benefit from some treatment. It took Mrs. Hogan a moment to take in the possibility that she was being insulted. The encounter made Nora feel brave. She would stop for nobody else, but she knew that what had happened was a mistake. She wondered if she'd ever done anything like this before in her life, acted on a whim without any thought for the consequences. Before she was married, she remembered, as she came back from work one day at dinner time, she found a stall of old books outside Warren's Auctioneers at the bottom of Castle Hill. As she perused the book, she found a volume of poems by Browning, one of whose poems she had loved in school. She was flicking through the pages when she was joined by old Mrs. Carty from Boring Hill. They both checked the price of the book, which was written in pencil on an inside page. It was far too high, and in any case she had no money. They both walked away and moved along Friary Place and up Friary Hill. As they parted at the top of the hill, Mrs. Carty handed her the book from under her coat. No one will miss that, she said. But don't tell anyone where you got it. Walking home with her new hair dye reminded her of walking into her mother's house with that volume of Browning's poems. It was the same feeling of guilt, the same feeling that someone would follow her and find out. Quickly, when she arrived home, she boiled some potatoes and opened a tin of peas and put 3 lamb chops on the pan. When the boys arrived, the potatoes were not ready. She waited upstairs, calling down to let them know that their dinner would be a bit late. She sat in front of the mirror at the dressing table and tried to work out if there was anything she could do to her hair to make it look more normal. She wished she had told Bernie not to use the lacquer, which was sticky and had a sweet smell. As soon as the boys saw her, they both became quiet. Donal looked away while Connor moved towards her. He reached up and touched her hair. It's all hard, he said. Where did you get it? I had my hair done this morning, she said. Do you like it? What's under there? Under what? Under what you have on your head. What I have on my head is my hair. Are you going to go out with that? He asked. Donal glanced at her and looked away. So I just realised that I've left my phone on and it's going to be turned off now before it rings and I have the indignity of having to... No, great. Done.
So you said when we were talking about what you were going to read that you would look for the only funny passage in the novel.
I think it probably is. Yeah, the rest of the novel is morose. In case anyone is going to buy the book thinking, there's a bundle of laughs in this book. It's not like that. No.
So, I mean, it's funny in the sense that it's a set piece.
Yeah.
But there's comedy in the characters all the way through, isn't there? The gramophone society and the...
Yeah, I mean, one of the... in Enniscorthy, which is a town of 6,000 people where I'm from and Nora Webster is from, it's in the southeast of Ireland. It was in a lot of Irish towns in those years where people really couldn't afford records. And some people didn't even have a record player. And so once a week on a Thursday night, people would gather in the local hotel, and one of them would choose the music, and the priest, who was in charge, of course, would bring in the stereo, almost like it was something for the altar, and they would put the stereo in the middle, and then each person's choice. Now, some of this was very funny, because, of course, some people's choice of music, as we know, is awful. And, I mean, there was one person who was interested in Hugo Wolf's songs. I don't know if you've ever heard them, but even Mahler didn't like them, you know. And I mean, they're just very, very tuneless and Germanic and long. And that was one person, but the person who really caused most trouble was a woman who conducted if there was orchestral music. And I mean, they were meant to be listening, and it would drive my mother nuts, and she'd come home and say, that woman has to be stopped. How can we stop her? The committee has to... Anyway, and so that all was, I mean, yeah. And
She's in the novel.
Oh, yeah,
Conducting away.
I put all of them in the novel. Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about Nora. She's sort of, in some ways, she's quite cold. She's restrained. One of the things I noticed early on in the novel is that she doesn't relate sensually to her children in a way that I thought, oh gosh, this is really strange. If it was a woman writing this novel, they would be talking about the smell of the children's hair but she doesn't. And then gradually you begin to realise that this is because it's a particular sort of repression that she has.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder about that. If you were seriously attempting to describe somebody whose maternal instinct was not fully formed. In other words, that if their children were in trouble, she would become fiercely protective. When they weren't in trouble, she became fiercely self-involved or thinking about something else. So the children were sort of wandering in her orbit. But no, there's no sensuality, there's no sense of taking any pleasure much from them. So she was, yes, I suppose repression is a good word for it, but I was interested in creating a character who wasn't necessarily good, sympathetic, sweet, or every reader would really want to meet. She's quite fierce at certain times, really unfair at others, and also abstracted some of the time, so she doesn't notice anything going on in front of her. And I just feel with the novel that we really have to worry about entering into a pact with the reader where we give each other just pure satisfaction. And it's almost like eating too much chocolate. You know, it's nice at the time, but really by the end you don't want any more of it. And so that I wanted to do something that was a bit harder for the reader to take. So that, of course, the main thing you can do in that situation is work her as a mother in ways which are strange, shifting. No one's ever certain of what she's going to do now, and ambiguous. So I wanted that.
So, I mean, one example is that when her husband is dying, she abandons her children, and she just doesn't go and see them. And then she becomes gradually aware that something's happened to them. And it's as if she's building up our expectation that there's going to have been some abuse, or they're going to have been whipped or locked in darkened rooms. When actually what we realise gradually is that their problem is that she abandoned them. It's about her. Nothing happened to them except that they were abandoned, which was everything.
Yeah, that you build up the expectation of something, but actually there's something there all along that you know, which is that that she made a decision, obviously, when the children, when her husband was ill, that she would just simply go, and left the children with an aunt of hers, presuming they were safe, and they were safe. But of course, she didn't know when. I mean, it's in the novel. She spends the entire novel, in a way, trying to get the children back, and they really won't come. I mean, sometimes they will, but mainly they won't. Mainly they're suspicious of her. They watch her.
And what I learnt from on Elizabeth Bishop, strangely, since it's technically a monograph of Elizabeth Bishop, is that this experience happened to you. That your father went into hospital when you were 8, and you didn't see your parents again until he came back with...
Yeah, I mean, what happened with the book on Elizabeth Bishop was it's published by an academic press, and I don't know if anyone here has tried to write a book for an academic press, but don't. I mean, first of all, they don't pay you, and secondly, I mean, they pay you something, but it's never very much. And secondly, two people can read your manuscript and write a report on it, and you never know who they are. and they can say anything they like about you, and everybody else gets to read it, and you can never, you get sent the 2 reports. So one of the reports had, it was pretty negative, but I keep guessing who that was, because I know it was someone in the English department in Princeton, where I used to work. So I keep going through my enemies, but then I think, could it be one of my friends? But both of the reports said that there wasn't, since this was a series called Writers on Writers, that there wasn't enough about me in the book. And I didn't think there should be, because I thought it should really be about Elizabeth Bishop. But then I relented, and I put in I think 2 chapters that simply try and relate the Elizabeth Bishop poems to things that I knew. And one of them was that idea that Bishop had dealt with in her life. Her father died when she was 6 months old. She was born in 1911, and she died in 1979. She was born in Nova Scotia, and she lived many years in Brazil. But her father died when she was 6 months old, and her mother was incarcerated in a mental hospital when she was 5. And she never saw her mother again, even though her mother lived for many more years. And her lover of many years, whom she met in Brazil, who was a wonderful woman and was a great love affair, actually committed suicide in the end in Elizabeth Bishop's apartment in New York. And so all this loss was there for her. And what's interesting for me is that she doesn't write a poem about it. That she does write a famous poem called The Art of Losing, or its first line is, "The art of losing isn't hard to master." But she doesn't then she names many things she lost, including keys or her mother's watch, but she doesn't name the thing that mattered most that she lost, or the things. So I was interested in this idea of withholding, of reticence, of producing a body of work where the main thing bothering you gets into the rhythms, is implied, is there somewhere, but isn't spelt out and constantly dramatized. And then I came to this book, having written most of Nora Webster when I was writing the personal chapters of the Elizabeth Bishop. And I just thought it was worth putting it down, writing it down once, and I have glanced over it several times in novels. Yeah, that when I was 8, my father needed a massive brain operation, and my parents simply disappeared. And they left us with an aunt who we didn't really know, in a place we didn't know, where no one knew us. And because I was 8 and my brother was 4, we were treated as adults at home. In a way, the older ones, and they were much older, had opened up space for us. So we decided on our bedtime. We decided if we didn't like food, we wouldn't eat it. Everybody knew what we liked and didn't like, and we had a pretty good time. We didn't ever realize that until we stopped having that good time. But the main problem was we didn't know where they were, and we didn't know what was going on, and we never knew what the future would be. And so when we came back home, neither of us ever was all right again, really. And years later, when traffic got really bad on the main road from Dublin to Enniscorthy, we used to use a side road, and we used to end up having to go by this house, and we would just go silent, and we'd get by the house, and we'd continue talking what we were talking about. We would never, myself and my brother would never discuss it. I don't think we ever did, discuss it, ever. And we'd go by the house in silence and just get on with then the ordinary conversation we had been having. So I just ended up, Tom Gunn, who you were talking about, didn't write about his mother's suicide until 43 years later. It's a poem called The Gas Poker, where he describes having found her body. But I think that idea interests me, of just, if something happens to you that you can't deal with in a personal way, well, you certainly can't deal with it artistically. What it does is it nudges, it insinuates its way into the rhythms. It finds its way in somewhere, so people could notice there's something funny in this book, but I can't name it. And then you just spill the beans eventually. And
This is the spilling of the beans.
This is the spilling of the beans, but this too has beans.
Well, it's because you are Donal in a way, aren't you? Because you had developed a stammer. You were the little boy who came out.
Yeah, all of those things. Yeah, I still have a stammer, but I just managed to work my way around it. I tend not to stammer if I can help it. But if you ask me my own name, it's the hard. For a stammerer, my name is a nightmare because it has a hard K sound at the beginning and then a hard consonant. And it simply won't come. So I would do everything. If you asked me my name, I would do all sorts of breathing, and I would look at you and I'd say I'm, it just wouldn't come.
And you talk in this about you made a study of 4 writers who you were passionately involved with when you were a teenager, which is that's Thomas Mann,
James Baldwin, Elizabeth Bishop, and Tom Gunn.
And you're saying that you thought that that what you discovered was that they were gay, and then you thought that actually maybe what united them was that they'd all lost parents in very young childhood.
I presume the reason why I was interested in Thomas Mann was that there was a sort of hidden homosexuality, overt it sometimes, but not others, and he was sort of navigating the waters of his own homosexuality really all his life as a writer, and. It's interesting that James Baldwin's first novel has no mention of it. The second novel is explicit. The third novel tries to bring the two together. But I was interested in Baldwin, and I thought it was because he was gay. And it was one night when I was reading an interview with Tom Gunn where I saw Tom Gunn trying to evade the subject, trying to say, well, I was pretty upset, but anyone would have been, wouldn't they? He was trying to shrug it off, his mother's suicide, as though it was nothing much, and that he got over it, he recovered from it. But when we did interviews for a Radio 3 documentary on Gunn, his boyfriend of 50 years, who's still alive, Mike Kitai, who he went to America to be with in 1954, Mike is still alive, and Mike said Tom could never talk about it. Tom could never deal with it. And I was interested in the fact that in both in the life and the work, something had happened which he couldn't name, but nonetheless, as I said, was in the rhythms, was somewhere in the work he would realize there's some wound here. There's a hurt that I'm feeling as I read this poem, even though the poem is about something even whimsical.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow through on that, the way that it works its way into the rhythm of the text, you say something really interesting about Elizabeth Bishop, which I think actually applies to your work as well, which is a word was a tentative form of control. Grammar was an enactment of how things stood.
Yes, that writing then became a way of controlling the known world and keeping the unknown one at bay. But yet the game would always be there to play, to let the unknown world back in. But you thought of grammar as a form of control. The rules of syntax are there so we can control our emotions so that our emotion does not exceed its cause. And yes, and that writing is a way of trying to describe how things stood, so that the sentence of statement, merely describing something that is or was there, becomes a way of both holding rhythm, so the rhythm can do its work almost like melody can, but also avoiding the implications, the full implications of that, by avoiding naming it, naming the pain, talking about loss directly.
And this comes through very strongly in the dialogue in this, doesn't it? I'm really struck by the way, the real precision with which you construct dialogue.
I think the thing at home in Wexford would be that people, I don't know if it happens here as much, where it might happen near the coast and in countries where there are long winters, people have a lot of time to think. And they realise that saying anything really is pointless. And therefore the thing to do is to say nothing much. And I'll give you an example of that where, where I live in Wexford now, there's a lot of coastal erosion. And about 2 years ago, someone's house actually fell into the sea, fell over the cliff. And I wasn't there for that event, so I came back and I met someone, and I realised by the look on his face there was news, and he needed to impart the news to me, but they'd never say anything direct. And he said to me, so-and-so, he named the family, they went into the village. I said, they went into the village? He said, they did. Meaning, of course, that they had nowhere else to live. Their house had fallen into the sea, so they'd gone into the village. And but he never said, he would just look at you and nod, and you'd learn to read the signs. Sorry, was there something that you...
No, go ahead.
No, just that way then of constructing dialogue around such a thing, someone saying, and that would be enough for the beginning, I say, hello, haven't been here, and they'd always say, you haven't been around for a while, and then they'd look at you, you've been in America, but they'd know where you'd been by some way, they'd hear everything. But sorry?
Yeah. It's just, I noticed that the way you put in he saids and she saids, you break sentences into two, you break thoughts into two sentences again and again and again, which sort of creates the abruptness of a particular way of speaking.
Yeah, and you can
For
get
example,
a sense of...
do this, just read that, just a teeny little bit. See it. So what you're doing is you're bringing dialogue into the literature.
I'm trying to write about the strange emotion around in Ireland in 1968 and 69, where some people, ordinary people in an ordinary town, thought we should attack Northern Ireland and take it back. And then other ordinary people thought we should most certainly not do that. and you couldn't work out who was going to have what position. And people would have one position one day and another position the next. Of course, they had no intention of going anywhere. But anyway, there's a fellow called Mick Sinnott, and he's a trade unionist, and he says, that's it then, no more, this is after Bloody Sunday, that's it then, no more waging around, a whole lot of us should just go over the border, take the place back. You'd look well, one of the girls said, they'd shoot you too. We'd all be well armed, he said, and we wouldn't be anywhere we could be easily found. You couldn't even shoot a dead rabbit stuck in a gap, another of the girls said. But I suppose I know what you mean, that you just can break the dialogue, almost give it a breath, or give a sense of the others listening. So you almost have like a camera turning for a second to the other.
Yes, which is how you, when you analyse the poetry and you talk about the beats in poetry, and I just thought I can actually see that in the way you do dialogue in your novels. There's the beat in it, sort of very, very precise. When it seems to be informal.
Yeah, I mean, I think in prose, if you start counting beats, you end up losing something. Whereas in poetry, I think you must count the beats in each line, just to know where you are, what you need to do. But in prose, you need to work on instinct. I mean, what happens is, I suppose, that an idea, something that you have thought of, been told, remember, or just an image, anything, moves of its own accord into rhythm when you're not paying attention. If you are paying attention and trying to force it, it won't come, or will come falsely. But if you're just doing nothing, a sentence will come, and that will give you your sound for a whole book. And you mustn't wait a second time, because now you must work. But if you become self-conscious while you're working about what the sentences are doing, or even that thing you pointed out to me, I certainly didn't know I was doing that. I can tell you now what it's doing, as though I'm in a seminar. But if I became too conscious of doing things like that, they would become tricks, and the reader would notice them. I mean, they would really stand out if you did them deliberately. You almost are operating unself-consciously or unconsciously with a form of tact rather than a form of deliberation. Mm-hmm. It's almost like you're sort of touching, or you can, You've talked a little bit about the history that lies behind the book, and again, it's incredibly lightly touched on, but there is really big history happening. I mean, we keep hearing about Jorge, who's being jailed and all sorts of stuff going on. I mean, and we're actually at the beginning of the Troubles. So the 60s, it's a different 60s, but it is the 60s. Yes, that. It's very odd to be in a country. I mean, I'm not sure there's. Is there another? I mean, other than countries in Eastern Europe, but in the West, where the Minister for Finance was arrested for gun running. I mean, what's the name of it? Osborne? Is that his name here?
Yes.
I mean, can you just imagine? Or imagine, imagine Nigel Lawson is arrested, and it would just come on the news, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Lawson, has been arrested for gun run. What? Gun running? And Charles Jorge filled our imagination in all those years because he was from a very humble background, and he became immensely rich. And the stories about his money and the champagne, and the houses he built and the holidays he had and the island he owned, and people presumed to use, if a restaurant opened in a small town in Ireland, someone would say, that's Charlie Jorge's money. It paid for that restaurant. And of course there were talk about his relationship with various women, one of whom later became a very good friend of mine, and he was arrested for gun running when he was Minister for Finance, and he spent 8 years in the political wilderness, came back as Minister for Health for 2 years. And there was a wonderful moment where he tried to introduce jogging into Ireland, for people to have better health. And he was trying to be a populist Minister for Health until somebody said that all he knew about jogging was horizontal jogging. And horizontal jogging became a very big phrase in Ireland, actually during that period. And he also, just since I'm on the subject of him, he introduced a thing which he called an Irish solution. He was very pompous, an Irish solution to an Irish problem. And it was that in order to get a condom, this was 1979, Minister for Health, in order to get a condom, you had to go to a doctor and get a prescription from the doctor. And you'd take the prescription to a chemist shop and show it to them in full light of day, and they would, or they might or might not stock condoms. So he did all those things, and eventually he became Prime Minister. And so, and he gave Margaret Thatcher the present of a Georgian teapot, and he opposed her on the Falklands War, And he did terrible things for the Irish economy because he couldn't stop spending money and he needed to make cutbacks and he couldn't do them. But he looms large over the imagination of people in these years because they always think he's behind everything. And of course, he did change my life at a certain age because in 1968 and 69, in his budgets, he increased the widow's pension by some enormous amount of money. And he backdated it a year. So what arrived in our house was called a lump sum. And if anyone ever wants to talk to you about social welfare and how cutbacks should be made, just imagine our house, a lump sum arrives. And out of the lump sum, things like a stereo record player, but also things we needed like clothes. But the lump sum made an enormous difference. It was an extraordinary phrase, lump sum. It was kind of beautiful. And he also gave us, I mean, my mother always voted for him because of the lump sum business.
And the lump sum makes a difference to Nora.
Oh, yeah. I put all that into the book.
Well,
Waste not, want not. I mean, what was I meant to do? Make it up?
But the point is, you don't put it into the book. You put it so Nora has this lump sum. You don't. But you've just explained the whole business, but you don't have any explication in the novel.
Oh yeah, no. If
If
you go into political background of the year in question, you lose the book. I mean, it just has to be almost. Well, it is all from her point of view, but it has to be almost from within her mind as well, even though it's in the third person. It's sort of third person intimate. And therefore, if you go into the author explaining backgrounds or footnotes, then you would lose the reader. So you just have to throw it in and just hope for the best.
We're all quite familiar with this history, reasonably familiar. I wonder what your American audience's readerships would think.
You know, I think they just expect Ireland to be strange. They think it's like Arizona. And, they just expect different things to go on there. And no, they're quite easy about it. They're quite good about it. Yeah.
But they just take it because they'd take anything from you.
Oh, I don't think that. I mean, you want to be a fool to think that. They could turn on you very quickly.
Now, I'm going to open it out to questions. I'm going to ask one more question just to give everybody a chance to think about their questions, because we need to have that first one coming quickly. And it's going back onto the relationship between truth and fiction. And it's, again, another line that comes out of this is that Elizabeth Bishop and her best friend, Robert Lowell, had a bit of an altercation later on, involving him putting real things into poetry. And there was this line that she quoted, which was originally from Hardy, which was that mixing fact and fiction in unknown proportions is an infinite mischief. Well, that's precisely what you're doing in your novel. You're mixing. And do you feel that that's a risky thing to do?
The reason I was interested in that row between Robert Lowell, I mean, what Lowell did was he had broken up with his wife Elizabeth Hardwick in New York. And he'd come to England and he was getting married to Caroline Blackwood, the novelist. And Elizabeth in New York was really shocked. She hadn't expected this. So she wrote him these heartbroken letters about how she felt. And she was a wonderful writer. And he made the letters into sonnets. And he was going to publish them without her permission. And he did, to a large extent, do that. Until Elizabeth Bishop got involved to say, infinite mischief, one, but also don't let anyone tell you this is not art. Somehow you've made this into art, but it isn't worth it. And that really frightened him because he saw what he was doing would look like to other people. The problem is that I depended on writing this book. I started it in 2000. I added to it every year. Over the last few years, I started to work harder on it. But it was, for me, the story of what happened that if I didn't write, I would actually... I couldn't, first of all, do anything else much, but also... making a novel up about some other family would be a sort of pointless activity while this was living in me in a way which was vibrant and vivid and constant. And it isn't autobiography. There's quite a lot made up in it. It isn't from my point of view. It's from my mother's point of view. But a lot of the things happened down to the smallest detail. In that part I read, not only the hair dye, which was a big event, but the stealing of the book is something that I would have heard my mother talk about. And it was Browning, and it was exactly there. Warren's Auctioneers, named precisely, bottom of Castle Hill. You would go up along Ferry Place, up Ferry Hill, to where my mother's family house was. So that is down to the smallest detail the case. And I did that over and over. And also, it wasn't just, it was a way of recovering a past that was completely gone now. You know, in other words, what I say in the Elizabeth Bishop book, that of all the people who came to that house we had in the summer, many, many people came. All of them are dead except 3. and I'm the only one who goes there still. And so that sense of a lost generation, I mean, a lost generation because time has passed and people have died, and just trying to get some of that back, recover it, bring it back in, try and find a shape for it, try and suggest that it still has a life, was also very much part of the enterprise or part of the impulse.
And it's your brother, presumably, is one of the three who's still alive?
No, he isn't.
Oh, he's not. So
No,
who
you
are the
see-
two of the three?
My two sisters.
Your
but
two sisters.
You see, he had died too, so suddenly it was a lot that was gone from that house where the three of us, my mother and myself and him were in the house, and now there was only me. And so I set about reconstructing it, because it really had all gone.
Well, let's, on that note, open it out to the floor. Who's going to ask the first question? I think there's somebody, is there somebody, a hand right behind the pillar over at the back? Can you,
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
It's very interesting you talk about writing it from your mother's point of view, because of all the books I've read of yours, they're very much from a feminine point of view. And of course, Testament of Mary is probably the most obvious, because that, we know the Bible stories and it's very much from a male point of view. Can you sort of comment on that? Is that a important theme to you, or?
I mean, I noticed in Ireland, for example, that John McGahern's first novel, The Barracks, is from a woman's point of view. Brian Moore's first novel, The Lonely Passion of Judith Hearn, is from a woman's point of view. So it wasn't that unusual within the Irish tradition. And we also had Molly Bloom's Soliloquy. When you got a bit older and you could get a copy of Ulysses, you could see what Joyce had done with Molly Bloom. But I mean, I have written novels such as the novel I wrote about Henry James, The Master, and The Heather Blazing, and I mean, there are other novels from the point of view of men. I think you should be able to do anything as a novelist, but that's not a very interesting thing to say about it. I mean, it sounds true. I wonder if it is true. But it might be also that, when I came to writing Brooklyn, which is about a woman who goes to America in 1950, and if it had been a young man, he would probably have got involved in sport very quickly, got a group of friends, he would have owned the streets, got a bar, swaggered about the place. So his bedroom would be, as a lot of our bedrooms still are, those of us who don't have, domestic situations, bedrooms are just completely a wreck, like train wreck. And, the domestic space is not important, whereas the street... So it would have been a very different novel with a lot of swagger in it. And I just wanted a lot of psychological purity. I wanted domestic space to become the space. And I wanted her inwardness to be the thing that mattered to her most, how she remembered, saw, noticed. And so that it wouldn't have worked in that case. And in the case of Nora Webster, because I saw all that happening, I know what it was like. And there's a moment later on in Nora Webster where she thinks about her son, who's me, thinks, he has been noticing me much more than I've been noticing him. And I remember writing that and just laughing to myself, saying, "Yes, mother, yes." And, although it's not a revenge book. I mean, it's not. I wasn't interested in that. But and also with the Testament of Mary, I mean, it would have been great to have written the Testament of Joseph if only he'd been at the foot of the cross. But he had gone before then. And but obviously, I was taking some with Mary. I was taking some of those tones that you get. For example, in Medea, in Electra, in Antigone, that idea of the voice belonging to someone who is otherwise powerless, and the voice becoming even more powerful because it comes from lack of power. Whereas in Antigone, what Creon says is almost like legislation, but what Antigone says has an extraordinary pitch to it and flavour. So I was just taking some of that and grafting it onto the story of the New Testament.
Got one over there in the third row.
I mean, I think in the end it was an artistic decision that if I let her meet, a travelling salesman who came to the town sometimes and started going out in the car with him, I would really lose something of the purity of the book that I wanted. And if I also had a big cathartic moment where she's on a hill and it's either a beautiful day or a very bad day, and something happens to her which lifts her completely out of herself, almost like an out-of-body experience or a spiritual experience, or one in which the grief completely lifts and goes, I thought that artistically is cheating, that you're actually trying to give the reader an epiphany, when if you could just stick to the dull business of being, of trying to survive, someone you were married to dying, and how that goes in waves. It's not there all the time as grief. It's there as sorrow. It's there as loss. It's not there. It's back again. That if you could just, and then imperceptibly you change. If I could just get that right within the framework of a novel, within a structure, then I would be doing something decent. Whereas the other business of trying to give her, as you say, a breakthrough, a way of pushing through, would be, I think, a form of cheating. And also, I don't think it would work. I think you would be saying to me, that piece of sugar you attempted to add to the tea was destroyed its taste.
I mean, she does it right at the end. It does come to her, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the German Requiem thing, where she is going to sing in the aftermath of the novel as a contralto in the German Requiem. I think the reader has a right to feel, as to put the book down, that is going to be a greater case. When she comes into the room and says to Donal, the younger son, I'm going to sing in the German Requiem, there is a feeling, something is going to happen. But I'm not going to describe it in the book. It's going to be in the aftermath of the book.
Mm. We've got another one in the second row, just down here. Oh, yes, there's a gentleman there, and then a lady in the second row here.
Is the idea of loss in the title of this evening just about the loss of a relative, a person? Or what about the loss of Ireland reflected in the mass emigration after the potato famine? And I'm thinking of Brooklyn particularly, where she loses her identity because she is pretty well sent to Brooklyn.
I mean, I suppose Ireland's very good sometimes at dwelling on loss in a way that you wonder if it's the best way of going about things. I mean, I was interested very much in what Prince Charles had to say yesterday. And I'm very impressed by it because he actually wanted to say, well, my granduncle was actually murdered here. And we have been trying to recover from this. And my friend was his grandson, whose twin brother was murdered here. And they went back to the place. But it wasn't all about, we forgive, we are with you. It was about, this is difficult for anyone who lost. And I suppose it's the same thing with emigration, that every family in over 150 years lost 2 or 3 people, and they never came back. And they were talked about in a funny sort of way, that they were outsiders. Within a few years, it looked as though they had actually become homeless in some funny way, and that obviously made its way into the, into the sort of soul of the society in certain ways. But of course, on the other side, you must remember that some of those people were so relieved to get away. You keep hearing about that. You meet someone in Australia, say, God, I'll never go back to that place again. I'm having such a good time here. But, it goes both ways.
You write the nostalgia of Ireland in the 1960s. About 10 years ago, I lived in County Wexford for a short time myself. And hearing now, recently on television, people being interviewed about the referendum on gay marriage, it sounds as though everybody thinks that Ireland has changed, that deep down it hasn't. What do you think?
I think it looks as though the side that I'm on, which is the yes side, I'm on it for pretty good reasons, because I'm gay myself, it looks as though it's going to win. It might be by a smaller majority than we thought, but it looks at the moment as though it's going to win. And some of that seems to me to be that people had the imagination to change, and they were often older people. And if they had a gay son or daughter, they really changed quickly. But if they had a gay neighbour, it became personal. It's quite a conservative movement. It's about inclusion. It's about bringing people into marriage. It's about getting a group of people who have sort of been offshore and bringing them onto the island. And the actual gay movement in Ireland, who has been managing this campaign, has managed it very, very well. By instead of going on television in 3s and 4s and shouting for our rights, we brought our parents on We brought our grandparents on. We brought our sisters on to say, look, we're in a family. Our family wants us to be happy. If you had a 15-year-old son who was gay or a 15-year-old daughter who was lesbian, what would you want for them? Would you want discrimination? And so that has actually been a big argument in the campaign. So it's been a very interesting, it's been a very Irish campaign in that it hasn't just been people talking about abstract things like human rights. It's been people talking about their children. And that's one of the reasons why it might win.
There is quite a brilliant video of you reading a speech you gave on this subject at Trinity, was it, last week?
Yeah, I mean, I went to Trinity last week, to Trinity College, and this is exam time. No one has any time. But it wasn't because of me. It really wasn't because of me. 400 kids came and filled the hall. It was because they wanted to go somewhere, be together, to actually support this. And all of them had things to say afterwards about their own lives. I mean, the ones who are not gay are as vocal as the ones who are. And especially if you're under some age, like 30, you see this as, look, we've got to get over these problems. And if we can do so in a referendum, in a plebiscite, it's even been better because of the Irish Constitution. We have to have a referendum, a full plebiscite on this, because marriage is named in the Constitution as between a man and a woman. But the plebiscite, which seemed a big problem at the beginning, has actually been very liberating, because we've had to had sort of an argument or make an offer or do a bargain with the entire society, rather than merely getting legislators to support us. And that has actually been liberating for a lot of gay people, including the fact, for example, about 2 months ago, I woke up one Sunday morning from Uneasy Dreams to find the Minister for Health, who's incredibly good looking. He's 30-something, he's half Indian, he's a policy wonk, he's terrific. He, just in the middle of an interview, just said, well, as a gay man, well, the whole country went, as a what? like if Leo Varadkar's gay, there's hope for all of us. And then he was followed soon afterwards by the Minister for Defence in the previous government, Pat Carey, who's in his 60s, and he doesn't look gay at all. And he announced one day, oh, I'm gay too, and I have been all along. All along? And then just last weekend, one of the best-known TV presenters, a woman, she came out and said, I'm lesbian. And so at last weekend, someone called me and said, I think the whole country might be gay. And that one by one, it would start with all the bishops, and then all the writers, all the writers are going, all the poets, and every group of people will come. But it looked like that for a few days. I mean,
have you got any more? No? I've got one more question, which is when you were talking about your publishers of this book wanting you to put more of yourself in. Did your publishers of the novel want you to put some more love interest in? I mean, that people who want to sell novels in large quantities.
Oh, I mean, it really has to be said in fairness that no editor would think of doing that. I mean, it's not just with me, but I think it's just not the way things work in publishing. That if there was something they thought was wrong with the book, having viewed the book's own terms, having viewed the ambition for the book, they might point out to you there's something. I mean, in America, my editor, Nan Graham, thought there were just things that didn't need to be said. And there were just some tiny cuts she suggested, which were very, very good ones. But they would never, ever try and direct you towards making a book more commercial. It simply wouldn't occur. Now, it may occur to some people. I have never come across it or heard a writer talking about it. I mean, it's obviously part of the fresh hell known as the future. But it hasn't, well, we haven't had it yet.
Because even you, I mean, Anya has a boyfriend, but he's pretty unattractive, really, isn't he?
Yeah.
It's not going to be a happy marriage, is it?
Yeah, I enjoyed making all those guys into sort of nerds. But, it so obviously for me wouldn't have worked for the book that I would have known how to resist it. I wouldn't have had any trouble with it. To say, no, this is really not what must happen. She has to do this journey on her own. And that's what the book is about. And it just didn't arise for anybody.
One more there, yes? Yes.
Okay, if your publisher wasn't demanding you to be more commercial, what about the film of Brooklyn? Is that, how hands-on have you been with that?
Oh, I've been really hands-off with the film of Brooklyn. Nick Hornby wrote the screenplay. And I wanted Nick Hornby to write the screenplay. I thought he knew something I didn't know. And I have enormous respect for what he does. And when I saw the screenplay, I realised what he had done was he'd done a lot of thinking. In other words, he had found a story at the centre of the book, taken everything else out and concentrated on something that would work in a single line in the film. It was a very, very clean script emotionally. And I had a few ideas for casting, and luckily John Crowley listened to me. There's a song in the middle of the film, which is an Irish song. It's in Gaelic, and it's sung by a singer called Iarlo Linord, who I have been following since he was about 18. He's a traditional Irish singer, and that was mine. And luckily the director listened to me. But all of the big casting was done by other people. And the only thing that did happen, I mean, I got a part in the film. They were doing some filming in Montreal, and I went up there, and they said, look, if you get up early in the morning, we'll put a costume on you and a hat, and you can be an Irish emigrant trying to get into America. Of course, I thought this was marvellous. And actually, they also had, it was very funny, they had a spare caravan, a spare trailer, that no one was using. So they put my name on it big, you know, so it looked like I was, you know, really important. And I took photographs myself I took a selfie. No, I didn't, but you know what I mean. And so I decided the night before, because I was going to have to look like an Irishman trying to emigrate, and I don't really think I do. So I thought I should start talking like one and just start trying to get an accent that was a bit more rural Irish and 50s, and I sort of look on my face, I was sort of different. And John Crowley, the director, said, look, come, we're trying to have our dinner. And the last, you know, like you have no speaking part in this film. Like you really are just an extra. You're a tiny moment. And the idea that you're going into method, you know, is really absurd, and you must stop. I said, oh, thanks very much, John. I'll take that. And but I do have a tiny second in the film, which took, I have to say, it took 3 days to film that tiny moment. But it was nice because the main actress, Saoirse Ronan, was behind me, and we could gossip about people while we were waiting for the thing to be set up again.
Oh, have we got time for one more? Yes, we can do one more at the back.
One more at the back.
One more at the back. We were given another 5 minutes. Just right in the back in the middle.
Thank you. Was it hard for you to give up your story to the story of the film? Or was it an experience of expansiveness, or did it contract? How was that for you?
You know, I think that there is a very funny relationship between novels and films, which is that in a novel, you have to do all the imagining. And part of the pact you have with the reader is that you don't have to describe a lot of things. The reader begins to imagine them. And that process of imagining becomes part of the process of reading. And so that by the time you finish the book, you almost own the book. So having then something visualized for you that you have already visualized internally in some mysterious way, I mean, not openly visualized, not said, oh, the building behind has to be red, but having some sense of that, and then seeing that taken from you, I mean, the imagining process, and shown to you in the way someone else has imagined, I think it's quite difficult for readers. But at the same time, you know, I'm from a small town, from a small house, and the idea of Saoirse Ronan, you know, who was in Atonement when she was 14. She's in the Grand Hotel Budapest. You know, she's absolutely terrific. She's super glamorous, and the idea of having her play your character, like, it's a pretty good idea, you know. And like Meryl Streep did the audio for the Testament of Mary. Like, I remember when seeing Meryl Streep for the first time, and the idea that if someone had said to me on the way out, you know, she's going to end up reading one of your stories, I would have said, yeah, and we're all going to live on the, you know, it would have seemed an impossible dream. So it is, I think it's part of a novelist's dream, having a film, even though the stakes are high, because readers do find, and writers too, that there's something in film that is so immediate and so almost crass in its demands on the reader's instant attention, in a way that an image is worth 1,000 words, but for how long? 1,000 words tends to last longer in the dream life or the imaginative life. So you're in a different process, and the only thing to do with this is to suck it up and to just not get in the way and not complain. You know, like they're doing you a favour in the end.
Well, Colm, thank you very much.
Very much.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Well, what can I add to that? Such amazing appreciation for a wonderful session, Colm and Claire. I never imagined that a session which was titled The Literature of Loss would be so entertaining. We'd have so many laughs. You made me think of Auden's wonderful lines in his elegy to Yeats, Mad Ireland hurt me into poetry. I think it hurt you into prose and poetry. And Claire, thank you so much for such a sympathetic and searching conversation with Colm. I'm going to ask you to remain seated while I take Colm and Claire to the bookstall where Colm will be happy to sign copies of Nora Webster or Elizabeth Bishop or anything else you'd like to bring him. And just to say, at the very beginning of this session, I thank Rathbinny Wine Estate for their support of this event. If any of you want to support the Charleston estate by contributing to a leaf on one of our trees in a minor way, our supporters desk in the marquee while you're waiting, while you're queuing up for books, just go and have a look and see the opportunities that you might have should you wish to do so. And once more, a big thank you to Colm and to Claire.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Claire.